The air was still. In the heart of the Colorado Plains, the early morning silence pressed in like a lid on a boiling pot. Below a low, rising sun, a river twisted through scrub and cottonwood. The water was shallow, sluggish, its muddy flow carved around a small sandbar, barely 50 yards wide, choked with driftwood, brittle brush, and a handful of men who had not slept in days. They were wounded, hungry, filthy, and surrounded, and any moment now, death would come from the riverbank. For 9 days, they had held this ground, just a tiny island in the Arikaree fork of the Republican River, a strip of sand no one had ever marked on a map. But in the fall of 1868, it became a battlefield, a forgotten Alamo, a last stand, and the men who bled here were scouts, U.S. Army volunteers under a young lieutenant named Frederick H. Beecher. They were expert riders, rugged plainsmen, and yet none of their skill prepared them for what came. Because what they were facing wasn't just an ambush. It was the full fury of the Plains tribes, united, enraged, and determined to drive the white man out, once and for all. This is the story of the Battle of Beecher Island, and the scouts who refused to die quietly. The summer of 1868 was tense across the American West. Treaties had been signed and broken, promises made and shattered. The Powder River War, the Sand Creek Massacre, Red Cloud's War, all still cast long shadows. The U.S. government had insisted on railroads, forts, and the peace policy, but peace, by now, was just a word printed on paper. Violence simmered on both sides. The Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Sioux had suffered years of betrayal and bloodshed. The bison were disappearing. White settlers flooded the plains, laying claim to sacred land. And when war parties struck back, burning ranches, ambushing freight wagons, the U.S. military responded with escalating force. To deal with the rising unrest, the Army authorized a new approach. They would form a special unit of 50 hand-picked civilian scouts, not soldiers, not green recruits, but men who knew the land, who could track, ride, shoot, and speak with tribes if needed. Their orders were simple: find the enemy, report back, and if necessary, engage. The man chosen to lead them was Major George Sandy Forsyth. A veteran of the Civil War, Forsyth was young but proven, brave, disciplined. He had seen what war did to men and what men could do in return. At his side was Lieutenant Frederick Beecher, just 26 years old, soft-spoken but sharp-eyed. Beecher came from a famous family of abolitionists and ministers. He believed in duty, in principle. They had no idea they were walking into a death trap. The scouts headed west from Fort Wallace in early September, cutting across the plains near the Colorado-Kansas border. On September 16th, a group of hunters and settlers arrived at the fort with news. A large Cheyenne war party had raided a settlement, killing civilians and driving off horses. Forsyth moved quickly. He took his 50 scouts and a handful of Army regulars, just 51 men total, and tracked the war party north. They followed hoofprints, burned grass, abandoned camps. For days, they pushed deeper into enemy territory, unaware that their every movement was being watched. On the morning of September 17th, they made camp near the Arikaree fork of the Republican River. That night, the silence felt strange. The horses were restless. The wind carried whispers, like distant chanting. Then the scouts spotted figures on the ridges, shadows, riders. They were not alone. Just before dawn, the attack began. Hundreds of native warriors, Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho, descended on the scout camp. They came screaming across the plains, rifles and bows raised, painted for war. Some rode bareback, others wore feathers, war paint, animal skins. Among them was Roman Nose, the legendary Cheyenne war chief. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, Roman Nose was a formidable figure, feared and respected. He had vowed never to fight unless his medicine was perfect. On this day, he believed it was. The first volley tore into the scouts' camp like a thunderclap. Men fell from their bedrolls, scrambling for cover. Horses screamed and bolted. Chaos erupted. But Forsyth didn't break. He ordered his men to the river, to the small island barely 50 yards away. Through mud and gunfire, they reached it. And there, in the swirling waters of the Arikaree, they made their stand. For the next several days, the island was a crucible. The scouts dug shallow rifle pits with knives, cups, and bare hands. They piled sand and driftwood into makeshift barricades. The river around them ran red. Flies swarmed the dead. Each day the warriors attacked in waves, firing from cover, circling the island, trying to flank and overrun. But the scouts held. They fought with Sharps rifles and revolvers, precise, calm, deadly. On the first day alone, a third of Forsyth's men were killed or wounded. Beecher was among the fallen. He took a bullet to the head while trying to carry ammunition to a wounded man. Dr. J.H. Moores, the surgeon, was also killed, shot while tending to the injured under fire. Forsyth himself was shot in both thighs, but refused evacuation. He continued to lead, lying flat in the sand, issuing orders. The men rationed water, used boots and saddle leather as makeshift tourniquets. Some dug shallow holes just to shield the dying from the sun. Still, they held the line. After 4 days, the warriors began to withdraw. They had expected an easy slaughter. What they found instead was unshakable resistance. But the scouts were nearly out of ammunition. Dozens were dead. Many wounded were delirious from pain and dehydration. Flies covered open wounds. There was no relief in sight. With no way to send for help, no telegraph, no messenger, Forsyth turned to his 2 best riders, Jack Stillwell, just 19 years old, and Pierre Trudeau, a Métis scout. Under cover of darkness, the 2 slipped through enemy lines and rode hard for Fort Wallace, nearly 100 miles away. It took them 4 days. They survived on swamp water and raw horse meat, hiding by day, riding by night. When they finally arrived, emaciated and sunburned, they collapsed at the gates. A rescue column was dispatched immediately. It arrived at Beecher Island on September 25th, 9 days after the first shots were fired. What they found was devastating. The island was littered with shallow graves and blood-stained sand. Survivors wept when help arrived. They hadn't eaten in days. Some were too weak to stand, but they had survived. Against staggering odds, 38 of the 51 scouts made it out alive. The battle shocked the nation. Newspapers called it the Little Island of Heroes. Medals were awarded, monuments erected. The island itself was renamed in honor of the fallen lieutenant, Beecher Island. But the war would rage on. The Battle of Beecher Island was not a victory in the traditional sense. No land was gained, no treaty signed. But it proved something else, that small bands of men, even when surrounded, could fight with honor. That courage wasn't measured in numbers, but in grit. And for the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho, it was a reminder, too, of the violence pressed upon them, of warriors lost, of futures stolen. Roman Nose was killed during the battle, shot through the chest while leading a charge. His death marked the end of a chapter. But not the end of the war. That would take years, and cost more than anyone was willing to admit. Today, the battlefield is quiet. A small monument stands by the riverbank. The island, once soaked in blood, is now overgrown with grass and cottonwood. But if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The whisper of hooves, the crack of rifle fire, the breath of men who refuse to give in. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.